Good afternoon. What a great start to this afternoon's panels. I'm Stephanie Pilot. I'm the director of the OU Division of Architecture. And it's my pleasure to introduce the speakers for this session, Toni Griffin and Mike Lydon. Toni Griffin is the founder of urban planning for the American City, based in New York. Through this practice, she served as project director for the Detroit Works Project Long-Term Planning Initiative and released Detroit Future City, a comprehensive citywide framework for urban transformation. Her firm's current clients include the cities of Memphis, Milwaukee, and Pittsburgh. Ms. Griffin was recently appointed a professor in practice of urban planning at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, where she teaches and develops values-based planning methodologies through the Just City Design Lab. She's held several public sector positions, including Director of Community Development for Newark, New Jersey, and Vice President and Director of Design for the Anacostia Waterfront Corporation in Washington, D.C. And Ms. Griffin will be speaking on design for the Just City. Our second speaker is Mike Lydon. He is a principal of the Streets Plan Collaborative, an international award-winning planning, design, and research advocacy firm based in Miami, New York City, and San Francisco. Mr. Lydon is an internationally recognized planner, writer, and advocate for livable cities. He collaborated with Jeff Speck and Andres Duaney in writing the Smart Growth Manual, which was named one of the top 10 planning books of 2010 by Planet Zen. And his work has been featured on NPR, in the New York Times, CNN, ABC News, City Lab, Smithsonian Magazine, Salon, Next City, and Architect Magazine, just to name a few. Mr. Lydon will be speaking on tactical urbanism. So please help me welcome first Toni Griffin.
My shirt says Detroit hustles harder. I've been asked that all morning, so I thought I'd let people know. I was feeling a little rebellious this morning, so that's why that's there. Okay. So I'm a bit of an odd man out, I think, at this conference, because I'm not going to present you any of my ideas or projects around placemaking or tactical urbanism. Instead, I'm going to put a challenge before us as designers, as planners, as zealot nuts, as bureaucrats, as public officials, and ask you to consider, is this work we're doing creating a more just city? So you might be thinking, okay, well, Toni, what is a just city? I'm going to describe that a little bit as we go along the way. But let me just tell you a quick story. So as Stephanie introduced, my career starts as being a trained and licensed architect in the private sector, moving into urban design and planning, and then having an opportunity to becoming a public official in the public sector for about 10 years, and then deciding that public sector experiment was really interesting, really good. I did great work, and then started my own practice after that. And I've worked in cities from Chicago to Harlem to Washington, D.C., a bit in Oakland, Pittsburgh, Memphis, Detroit, and Milwaukee, and I found that I continued to confront a similar set of issues and challenges everywhere I went. The tale of two cities, similar disparities, racial divides, racial and economic segregation, gentrification. And so I was beginning to reflect upon my work, and I believe that I have a good body of work that I think produced good results and good impacts and great spaces. But I wasn't sure that I was making dents on some of the deeper and more systemic issues that I continued to confront in city after city. So when I got an opportunity as founding director of the J. Max Bond Center at the School of Architecture at the City College of New York, so very similar to Shane's Institute here, the Quality Communities Institute, I decided to take a slightly different bent. So instead of creating a community design center that did outwork and collaborative work with community partners, I really wanted to ask a very simple question. Can design have an impact on social justice? Can we really begin to chip away at these notions of equity, inclusion, access, connectivity, tolerance? And what were the ways we were doing that? And what were some real measurable ways that we can examine and hold ourselves accountable to that? So I named the center the J. Max Bond Center on Design for the Just City, and I started by creating a class called Design for the Just City. And in that class, one of the first things I asked students to do is take a stand and a point of view around what the Just City was. And I asked them to do that in the form of manifestos. So what I'd like to do is take 5 or 6 minutes and show you one of the students' work.
social steps. I just want 4 walls and adobe slabs for my girls. I don't mean to seem like I care about material things, but it's social steps. I just want 4 walls and adobe slabs for my girls. I don't mean to seem like I care about material things, but it's social steps. I just want 4 walls and adobe slabs for my girls. I don't mean to seem like I care about material things, but it's social steps. I just want 4 walls and adobe slabs for my girls.
So thank you for letting me share that. So that was produced by a Jewish man and an Iranian woman. And there are 2 big lessons, I think, that come out of that are important and maybe create the continuum of conversation for today. I think one is that, and this has been a common theme that we've heard, when you do ask the true owners of the city, which is inclusive of all of us, you get different answers depending on the sort of station and place that that person experiences the city and wants to experience the city. So our interventions are enriched by the conversation we have with the collective. And the other point that I think it expresses, and it's really embodied in the last question, is that we really all do have a role in shaping the just city and creating vibrant, dynamic places that work, whether you're the zealot nut, the trained designer or planner, or the bureaucrat. And so part of what I want to try to talk about a little bit this afternoon is really an encouragement on how we all need to have clear focus and intention on achieving the goals of the just city. So again, going back to my class, I asked my students to create these manifestos. They do it in the video form. They do it in these collage form early in the class. And I asked them to reflect on their personal experience. I asked them to reflect on the aspirations they have for themselves in their role as designer, planner. And I asked them to sort of put themselves in the position of protest or contest. What is it when you look out into the city and your community that you don't like, that you want to change? And how do all 3 of those things inform what you might think the just city should have? I asked them to use tools like Instagram and their camera or camera phone to go out and observe what spaces of injustice or justice look like. And so if you go to #JustCityOrNot on Instagram, you will find a catalog of over 900 images that begin a dialogue around the spaces of injustice and justice that we find in different communities. I asked them to map justice. This is Union Square Park in New York. And I asked them to go out and do observational work, to examine and make points of view about spaces and activities that they think may be performing justly or unjustly in the city. And I did this because, again, the wonky part of me wants data to help substantiate where I'm making advancement and improvement in my work. And when I started looking at evaluative frameworks like the metric indicator frameworks for sustainability or resiliency or happiness and livability, I found a couple of things. One is that they tend to provide a very uniform set of metrics and standards that define those propositions for sustainability, resiliency, livability, or happiness. And cities around the world become resilient or sustainable if they meet those 12 metrics or those 20 metrics or those 10 metrics. And one of the things that I was interested in doing at our center was saying, well, a just Oklahoma City, this probably doesn't look like a just Newcastle, Australia, or just Dallas, or just New York City. And what if we provided a way for the citizens of those cities and those communities to ascribe themselves the set of values they believed helped to move them towards a more just city? So how could you build a framework that was participatory enough in a way to be authentic and contextually unique to the challenges and opportunities that you faced in your city? So what we did is we set out to build a framework model that first started with value propositions. What is the value aspiration of your city? Not the outcome aspiration, like I need 10,000 new affordable housing units. But you need more affordability. You need more inclusion. You need more choice as the starting proposition. And from that, begin to actually confront and acknowledge the spaces and conditions, both socially and spatially, of justice and injustice in your city. Set out a core set of objectives or well-being indicators around health, the economy, your civic culture, your cultural identity, your environmental identity, and your aesthetic identity. And then begin to ascribe yourself a series of indicators and metrics. So as the center has evolved and as I've now sort of migrated that work into Harvard at the Just City Lab, we have come up with 12 broad themes of values for the Just City, and within those are 50 distinct metrics or indicators of values for justice. The bigger themes include rights and welfare and democracy. It includes resiliency, power, and engagement. It includes acceptance and fairness, choice, mobility, and aspiration and identity. And again, within each of those, the more robust set is 50. And the idea is if we were to engage a conversation in this room around what makes for a just Oklahoma City, which values would you tend to gravitate to? Would they be values that you feel you want to preserve because they already exist? Would they be values you'd want to grab because you feel like there's some deficiency and you want to lift the community up in that way? And I promise you those set of values would be different from the Sweet 16 values that we selected in a community in Pittsburgh. So we wanted to test this theory out, and so we partnered with the firm of Dell Studios, and Jan Gell is a fairly renowned urban designer with a practice out of Copenhagen that believes that public space has the potential to enrich public life. And he endeavors to work on design solutions that promote and expand vitality in public space. Their firm had done some work with New York City and the Department of Transportation to imagine what it would be like, and actually Susan showed an example of this when she talked about Corona in New York, Queens, that if you reappropriate roadway space and create new public space in a community, what could that do in terms of vitality? They learned of the work we were doing around social justice and design and wanted to see if we could layer in some frameworks and some metrics to evaluate how social justice was performing in that space. So we combined our two methodologies to create a very unique framework to evaluate the spaces. From our framework, we chose equity, diversity, choice, participation, access, inclusion, connectivity, beauty, creative innovation, and ownership. We combined that with Gell's public life, public space criteria, which was around protection, issues of feeling safe, secure, and climate, issues of comfort around walkability, sitting and staying, seeing, mixed functions, activity, listening and talking, and enjoyment, the human scale, identity, and activation of the senses. We use 4 distinct data survey methodologies, from secondary research to intercept surveys to interviews and observational surveys. And out of the 50 plazas that currently exist throughout all 5 boroughs of Manhattan, we chose 7 to investigate, 2 in Manhattan, 2 in Queens, and 3 in Brooklyn. These different spaces kind of fell into 3 different sort of typologies of space. Some of the plazas existed in destination sort of oriented neighborhoods like the Flatiron District, which is in and around Macy's department store. Some were centered around a transit node, and some were really just kind of rooted in the heart of a residential neighborhood. We wanted to ask ourselves very distinct questions, and we spent a lot of time trying to focus our research agenda around what is it we're really trying to answer. We asked ourselves questions like, do new spaces promote greater diversity of users? Does it create more choice of outdoor activity? Are public spaces facilitating greater transit connectivity, but also social connectivity? So we spent a lot of time really trying to link questions to specific value propositions and value outcomes. There were 11 different broader indicators in total and 40 distinct metrics. I'm going to just give you a little overview of some of the findings that we found, 6 in particular. So we looked at choice, and for us it was very important to create a distinct definition for what we meant by that. Because language is very important. Again, when I say equity to you, I imagine there are going to be at least 50 different definitions of that. So it was important that we had clarity around what it was we were seeking. In this case, choice was the ability for any and all communities to make selections among a variety of options of places, programs, amenities, and decisions. So as Susan and a few other speakers have said, it's not only about the outcome that we were seeking to affect, but it was about the process. So the choices you have in being at the decision table were just as important to us about the decisions of where you could sit in the plaza. And so when you design for choice, it meant for us, do the users and community have multiple options and flexibility for what they do in the plaza and how they configure the plaza for different activities. So we went and did an investigation of the programming of activities within the space, and we ended up charting it by type of activity and time of month or time of year, months throughout the year, to determine where there were ebbs and flows of activity, and were there, each of these plazas, maximizing the opportunities that residents or visitors or workers had in terms of what they did in the plaza. Another value we looked at was connectivity, linking people, places, and opportunities through physical and social connections. So designing for connectivity was about the plaza sufficiently connected to a variety of modes of transportation and amenities, but it also meant do users of the plaza feel connected to one another, forming exchanges or actual relationships between one another. So here we used an intercept survey, and we would ask people if they, upon coming to the plaza repeatedly, were they both beginning to recognize more people than they had before, and were they actually, talking to people? We like to think that our public space brings us together, but oftentimes we end up in a public plaza doing this. Yeah? You've done it, right? So if, public spaces are the great sort of conveners of democracy and engagement, are they really engaging one another? And so we found that, interestingly enough, in the Manhattan plazas and the more destination plazas, people weren't really recognizing people or forming bonds. In the neighborhood plazas, they were doing more so. And we were able to segment this data by race, by generational age groups, and by income. And we also found that populations of lower income had the higher rates of connectivity, that they were more apt to form relationships than people of higher income means. And there's all this data, and I'll tell you how to find it afterwards. Diversity was something we looked at, which we talked about as the acceptance of a mix of program, people, and cultural norms. So we wanted to make sure that we were accepting difference as a proposition for diversity, and we weren't just looking at the stats in terms of numbers of different types of people or activities you had. So we wanted to look at, does the plaza offer a range of different activities and options that reflect the culture of the neighborhood and or its users. It also means, does the plaza attract a diverse set of populations? We scanned this by looking at the ethnic and race, and age and gender populations of the neighborhoods in which the plazas sit, and compare that to the diversity of the plaza activity themselves. And in most cases, we found that those generally aligned, but the interesting conversation we had is that they tended to only reflect the composition of the neighborhood. So if you weren't from that, so it gave you a sense of, if I'm going into this community and it's predominantly Puerto Rican, do I feel welcome? Even though it is a reflection of the actual neighborhood, it is. And this gets into another one of our values, one of my favorite, which is ownership. The ability to have an equity stake in a process or an outcome. And when we wanted to look at designing for ownership, we were talking about, does the plaza promote one's belief that the space belongs to them or their neighborhood, and a sense of stewardship for the plaza's activities and upkeep. Here again, we used an intercept survey, and we asked people a simple question: does the plaza belong to me or to you? And most people overwhelmingly felt yes. They felt like this was a part of my neighborhood. It is my plaza. And we thought that was extremely positive. We also asked people as a proxy for ownership if you, would you pick up a piece of trash in the plaza if you saw it? And the responses were overwhelmingly yes. I think we asked the question wrong. If I ask you, would you pick up trash? I'm looking you in the eye, you're going to feel a little guilty. You're going to go, yeah, sure, I would do that. The question should have been, have I ever picked up a large piece of trash in my neighborhood? And again, this was a way for us to further sort of delve into, if you feel like the plaza is yours, what is the next step that you take to actually be a part of its stewardship? Because when you own something, like you own your house and your front yard, you're out there picking weeds. And so we wanted to figure out if these plazas can engender a greater sense of ownership in neighborhoods. Inclusion and belonging, another one of my favorites, the acceptance of difference and the intention to involve diverse opinions, attitudes, and behaviors. So designing for inclusion, belonging for us means, does the plaza improve one's sense of being accepted regardless of difference and the feeling of safety? I think this is very important because we can all sort of think about the way we kind of give the evil eye, or people shun the skateboarder in the public plaza, or shun the homeless person that's lying on the bench. That is a form of exclusion, like it or not. And so is the way that we design space vis-a-vis the things that we put in it, the culturally normative design standards that we put in spaces that might not necessarily feel like they're of my culture, or the cultural appropriation that is allowed to be in space and feels a bit antagonistic or different from the way in which I've designed it to be so pristine. These things have a way of perhaps unintentionally making someone feel like they don't belong or that they're not included. And we'd like to move that towards more inclusion. This writing's really small, I have to get up on it. So here we asked both about the perceptions and realities of feeling safe in the plaza. This was overwhelmingly high for men. It was mixed for women in terms of that reality. And we asked this by gender, by age, and again by race. I think this is the last one, which is around participation, the active engagement of individuals and community members in matters affecting social and spatial well-being. Here we really asked about how much they visited the plaza. And again, we were pleased to see there was an overwhelming number of people who began to use the plaza on a regular basis. There was another question we asked, however, around their participation in the process of designing the plaza. And Susan, you spoke to this and talked about some of the ways that people participated. But we asked the average user, most people were unaware that they could have a voice in shaping the plaza, its programming and activity. So here again, a disconnect between ownership, a disconnect between participation. And the whole intent of this was really to get underneath the hood of, I think, some of the rhetoric we use around our aspiration for achieving certain outcomes, and really taking a deeper dive to examine if in fact those exist. So the Design Lab has a website called designforthejustcity.org. On that website, you will find a digital version of the complete study we've done. It has all of our metrics, all of our indicators, and all of our methodology. I encourage you to use it, incorporate it into the way you think about not only assessing public space and how it's performing in your communities, but more importantly, if you do it, to figure out if it begins to guide differently and with a different intention the interventions that you use to try to solve for it. We've also created an ebook called the Just City Essays, Volume 1, where we asked a collection of 26 different professionals from around the world, so representing 9 different cities, to ponder this question about what is the just city. And so that is also available for free on the website. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hello. How are you? Good afternoon. Are we awake, maybe? How about there in the top in the back? You guys awake? All right, cool. I'm just going to wait a second for my slides to come up, but I want to ask a question. How many of you have heard of this wonky term called tactical urbanism? Let me see your hands. Okay, maybe about a third of you. Great. This hopefully will be new material for you all today. I will quickly tell you a little bit about street plans. as was introduced, we're in 3 different cities, and we do a lot of planning and design projects around public space, streets, and transportation. But one of the big drivers for our work from really the beginning with my partner Toni and I has been what we call research and advocacy. So a lot of our work as consultants with professionals is informed by being advocates first for ourselves and for better communities. Oftentimes in our work, we're asked to take a look at streets and come up with a vision or a plan to make them, more safe, more walkable, more friendly to more types of users. We might come up with a vision that looks like something like this, okay? And for the early part of my career, I thought, well, that's kind of the magic of planning, right? You go from what it is to what you want it to be, and then you hand it over to someone to go and build. And very quickly I learned this is not the reality. So welcome to the real world, Mike. Convincing people that change is good, that it's possible, is hard work. And for a long time, I think planners, architects, designers have been coming at it perhaps in some of the wrong directions. And this may be why this stat is more or less true, that most of the work and the plans that we do don't get implemented. And we saw lots of stacks of plans from Susan and others earlier today, and this challenge of overcoming the lack of ability to implement. And there's this wonderful quote from Jane Jacobs, who I'm sure some of you might know, who says that city planning lacks tactics for building cities that work like cities. And what I think she means by that is that cities lack all the small ways to connect and engage and work to create better streets, public spaces, neighborhoods at a smaller scale. Again, another theme that we've heard a lot about today. So one of the things that we're advocates for at Street Plans, with I'm sure many of you and our colleagues who have been speaking today, is finding new ways to build our neighborhoods together. And so tactical urbanism is one of the ways that we've been trying to do that. Now, the word tactical sometimes has a military connotation. That's not really what we're talking about, although we might engage in some guerrilla crosswalks now and again. But the idea is to use very small-scale actions that serve a larger purpose. So tactical urbanism is all about, working with projects that are intended to create lasting impact. If your project is 1 day long and you're not thinking about, 1 month later, 1 year later, 10 years later, then it's not necessarily tactical. So another point that I would like to make is that it can be led by cities, it can be led by nonprofits and community organizations, and it can be led just by individuals or small groups of people. And again, we're thinking about how we connect people to that lasting change. And it's kind of the thing where you kind of know it when you see it, to a degree, right? This is a project that we recently had opportunity to work on in West Palm Beach. And it was about taking a whole intersection near the train station and working with a bunch of student artists who are in high school to redesign what that space would look like. And again, the idea here is that we want people to actually engage in the doing, inviting people to not just comment on a map, but actually physically get out together, come up with a concept, and just go do it. That's what that intersection looks like at night, all designed by students. So we've written about this idea, about this movement in a number of different ways, in a number of different countries, from Australia and New Zealand to Italy to South America. We most recently published a materials and design guide, which has about 55 different materials you can use at a very low cost to implement your change on your streets and in your public spaces. And at the heart of this movement is really about learning, right? It's action-oriented, so it's about building something, even if it's very inexpensive and small and short-term, measuring what works and, more importantly, what doesn't work when you've put a project into the ground as a pilot or as a prototype or as a demonstration, and then learning from those experiences to feed that back into your process. So we think about projects in iterations. And again, it starts small. So I'm going to take you back to 2011. That's Victor Dover right there. Hi, Victor. In Miami. And this was 6 years ago, and we were just starting to write about and think about tactical urbanism as a way to bring about city transformation. And that's my partner Toni standing in the white shirt. This is parking day when people around the world, it's the third Friday in September, people take back parking spaces and make them little parks. It's fun, it's engaging, it sends a message, but it can be critiqued. And in fact, on this day, it was critiqued by one of our colleagues named Ralph Rosado. And he said, this is all well and good that you put the park in the street, but it's gone tomorrow, and you're doing this on such a small scale. He questioned how would this ever make change. And so we kind of took that challenge seriously. And we started thinking bigger. This is now 2012. What could we do on Biscayne Boulevard, which is the main highway that cuts through downtown Miami and cuts people off from the neighborhood from the actual Bayfront Park and the waterfront itself. It's 8 lanes of traffic. It's 100-foot wide medians that are full of car parking spaces, and it's a barrier, psychologically, physically, et cetera. And the idea was, can we instigate change in taking a plan that already identified these, not just one, but actual 6 medians in the middle of the highway, and reverting those back to public space, and then take the street from 8 lanes and shrink that down. But the problem was we really didn't find any political will to do that. So we got a very small grant for about $10,000, worked with Ralph, who now he said, now you got to be a partner in this mission to scale this whole thing up, and we turned it into a park for 1 week. So we call this a rendering in real time. That's real grass. These are real people. That's real gospel music. That's real bocce ball. And with all these people using the space, we were able to actually get a better understanding about, would people actually walk out in the middle of this highway? Would they use the space? How would they use it? Could we showcase to the politicians that this is something that's worth investing in? And the feedback we got was great, and we were relieved, because one of our strategies going into this was, if we could partner with 25, 30 organizations, as we did, to program and activate this space, all different kinds of uses and users, then if it goes really well, we can all spread that positivity through our networks and claim credit. And if it goes really poorly, then we can spread the blame across 25 or 30 organizations. Lo and behold, it did go very well. It convinced the DDA, the Downtown Development Authority, that this was worth investing in. They had several conversations with the Florida Department of Transportation. And this is the concept they came up with, which was to shrink that street from 8 lanes down to 4, and then return those parking lots in the middle of the street into a pedestrian promenade. So now we got more political will built, but we're still kind of stuck with parking lots in the middle of the street. How do we keep instigating change? What's that next revolution in build, measure, learn? Could we scale it up and take it further? So here you see about 2 months ago, volunteers out in the middle of one of the first parking lots there, actually painting this big mural on the ground and turning those spaces into something that looked like that. So lots of different uses and users, from playgrounds to passive recreation space, dog park. We got on-street parking onto that street for the very first time. This is that 8-lane street, bike share, et cetera. Calm that street down. And what we learned was a lot through the 23 days that this was up for the community to enjoy, and the 20,000 people who did wind up enjoying it. And one of the key lessons we learned was that Miami is really, really hungry for a local public square, a local plaza, something that could be a gathering spot in this part of the city that many people could access. Miami's not New York. We don't have 50, Miami does not have 50 plazas spread across different neighborhoods. They really have no space like this in the downtown, which is why it was so critical that we brought this back to the public, and said, look, we can keep this moving. And what it did was, as powerful it is to implement these projects, it can be even more powerful to take them away. Because once it's gone, people know what they're missing, for better or for worse. And so this was an op-ed that was written in the Huffington Post. And the political support, including Miami Commissioner Ken Russell, who this project was in his district, committed publicly to making this a permanent project by the end of his term. So we feel good that we're ready for that third and final iteration, possibly, which is to construct this thing in the long term. So we look at projects in these iterative processes and find them to be more engaging and more powerful, and being able to convince people that change is possible. So demonstration projects, for example, might be a 1-day to 7-day time interval. Different kind of, certain kind of materials that work over that time scale, have very low budgets, can be driven primarily by community groups. There's pilot projects. If you have a successful demonstration or you want to jump to the pilot, maybe that's a month to a year. Gives you a chance to really collect robust data and study the spaces and what's working and, again, what's not. Interim design can help you go from the pilot to, you usually have a period of time between a pilot being successful and then waiting for that long-term investment. So then we look at finally delivering that capital project. Now, it's not always going to go 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, but these are the steps that we find to be very, very successful for many cities, starting with grassroots action on up to deliver lasting capital projects. So tactical urbanism encourages people to work together in new ways. When you're asked not to show up to a cafeteria or a public library at 6:30 on a Tuesday, but asked to, would you like to come out into the street and try some things out? You want to paint the ground, you want to plant a tree. It's a very different way for all of us to engage. It allows people to experience a different reality, something that you have maybe only proposed in a map or on paper or in conversations behind closed doors. So in this way, we can widen public engagement. When we set up our projects, we engage a lot of people, have lots of conversations with business owners and neighborhood residents, so we can design something and think about a project that would work. But I think most importantly, what we get the most feedback from and engage the most people around is once the project is there. People can react to it. We're bringing the concept to where they are in their daily lives. It's a lot easier to have conversations in that space than it is to, again, invite them to a public meeting. And of course, we're always testing aspects of plans and designs. And if things are successful, we can keep these projects around, even with low costs, to deliver public benefits faster. So you don't have to wait that 10 years or 20 years just to get a plaza built. Maybe ultimately this is about breaking down some of the silos. This is not a very conventional way of doing planning. You can see here the silos that we talked about earlier today. Architects get charged with very specific kinds of projects that they want to do, perhaps on the right. Transport planners work on certain things in the middle. And then sometimes people do whatever the hell they want, right? And we can learn from this at a fine-grained scale, right? That planners and designers do not have all this figured out. Trust me, we're not actual experts. We're trained, we can explain these things, we can even draw them, but we can't always tell you what's going to work. So taking a step back and thinking, how do we do the short term and the less cost-intensive and more low-risk projects to learn is really, really important. And of course, government doesn't always lead the way. We don't always have a New York City DOT building plazas. In fact, most cities and towns don't have governments that are spending hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars on plazas. But if people feel comfortable and they have the agency, and some people feel more comfortable than others, I think what Toni just shared shines a light on that. There's lots of disparities and differences in who feels comfortable and how to act. But a lot of people are getting more emboldened. They're thinking, this is our neighborhood. We're tired of children getting hit by cars. We're tired of seeing seniors feel trapped in their neighborhoods. Let's try to make it more walkable. So earlier this week, I was in Tacoma, Washington, and I brought up this newspaper clipping from 2013, where the city decided to crack down on these crosswalk vigilantes who wanted to make their streets safer with crosswalks. They put 10 into the streets, and the 10 were removed very quickly at the expense of the city. It doesn't have to be this way. We've set up these frameworks in terms of planning and building cities that are very adversarial. It's the community and the stakeholders versus the professionals and the consultants, and we don't do a very good job at building bridges. So I want to tell you about a different kind of response to that same sort of initiative. So just up the road from Tacoma in Seattle, there's a neighborhood called Africatown, and every year they have an arts festival and a parade. And ahead of that parade, a couple years ago in 2015, a group of people went out in the middle of the night with paint buckets, and they decided to paint their crosswalks red, green, and black. These are the colors of the Pan-African flag. Why did they do this? Because this is an African-American neighborhood. It's had culture in this neighborhood for quite some time, and the slow tide of gentrification has been changing the dynamics of their community, and they want to mark their place and say, look, we are here, this is our community, our culture. You can see it in the sidewalks, which we'll be walking over during the parade. A bold move, and one that I think is very exciting, and the city, to their credit, said, look, we understand why you took this action. Technically illegal, but we get it. What can we do to work with you to make that permanent? Because ultimately, if you're talking about doing DIY, guerrilla, tactical projects, and you're using low-cost and temporary materials, there's a real limitation to that. How long will that last? How ultimately safe will it be in the long term? And what's incredible about a city like Seattle or others who have had a similar response is that you can build trust in your citizens by saying, you know what, why don't we make that permanent? We get it. We can, as a city, come back and use our resources to make sure that this is a longer lasting project. And so now that launched in Seattle, what's called their Community Crosswalk Program, where the city allows community groups to come up with designs and plans for intersections and for crosswalks, and then they'll go out and they'll actually implement them, which is fantastic. And as Ed Murray says, this is about celebrating, enhancing community identity. So these projects exist on a spectrum, from the unsanctioned to the sanctioned. And what we've been studying and looking at in our work is how quickly and what moves something from, say, an unsanctioned project like in Seattle to being sanctioned within a matter of weeks. And it happens more often than you think. And so we wanted to ask this question, too, though, is why is it the city always has to be reactive? Can we not be proactive in developing a framework for community groups and residents, business owners to really just engage in projects from the beginning to work tactically at this small scale to be engaging if there are these benefits that come with that approach? And so like a lot of the speakers are already today, we've kind of arrived at this point that we're working under an operating system for our cities that is very, very outdated. Is not necessarily responsive to the way that we live our lives today, to our technologies, to our challenges and issues within various different kinds of cities. So we need to change the software to ultimately get the better hardware. And I'm going to end with one more example from Burlington, Vermont. Burlington is a college town of about 40,000, so actually quite smaller than this city that we're in today. But we were asked to look at their cycling and their pedestrian network to develop a plan. And this is a really exciting project for us because Burlington is known to be fairly progressive. They've got about 6% of people already cycling daily. They've got about 20% of people walking. It's a pretty interesting place to work. So we developed this long-term network. We call it AAA network, which is all ages and abilities. And these blue lines, which may be a little hard to read in the back, but the north-south and east-west, that's called a minimum grid, so that people could be in protected bike lanes and cycle, from the campus down to the waterfront, from the north of the city down to the south. But we came up with this vision, which is aggressive, and it's long-term. It's at least 10 years out. And we knew that it was going to be hard, right? So like even in a progressive community like Burlington that's constantly trying to try new things, talking about removing street space from automobiles to give it back to other users is hard. And all you have to do is ask Peggy O'Neill, who is a mother who wanted to do a one-day pop-up bike lane just as we were starting our planning project. And she took this proposal to the city and said, I've got a lot of parents who are concerned about children's safety, getting to school. And the city said, wow, that's a really interesting idea. We'll take a look at it. And they looked at it and they said, you know what, Peggy? We just don't have a way to say yes. We're worried about liability. We're worried about the design, what materials we have. We don't have a budget for it. All the reasons that they could lay out that basically made this impossible. And we said, well, that's a shame. When we learned about Peggy's proposal, we said, well, let's think about a new framework. Is that possible? And how you could deliver lasting long-term change, starting with these one-day projects if you have citizens who are ready to engage this way. This is Church Street, which is their main downtown street in 1970. They were doing tactical demonstration projects 40 or 50 years ago. And we found this to be the case in many, many communities around the country. This stuff is not necessarily new. And Church Street, again, looks like that today. So it was really teaching people we could reclaim public space, which they've done over the long haul. And we asked this question, why can't we make this happen? Let's make this happen. If you're so interested in this being a possible pathway to develop support for projects, let's create a policy and a program that allows you to do that. And of course, we had to answer these questions between citizens who probably want to move quickly, don't want to go through a lot of bureaucracy and jump over hoops and cut red tape. And the city who's like, well, what's going to be safe? What are the materials? Are we liable? How do we evaluate these projects? And our role oftentimes is to serve as a bridge between community activists and the actual city itself. So we developed with the city, lots of different folks in the city and the activists, a community-led demonstration project policy and guide. And we know just enough to know that we don't know everything, right? And we wanted to actually test out our policy before we adopted it citywide. So this was, again, part of our master planning process and became an add-on to our scope of work, where we said, let's go out and test 4 different projects around the city on one weekend and use our policy and process to see what works and what doesn't to work out those bugs. And of course, we wanted to engage people in a different conversation about what the streets could become, and of course, test some of our planning concepts on the ground. So we organized this during what's called Art Hop, which happens on a Friday and Saturday. It's an event that attracts 10,000 people. It's an art-oriented festival on one part of the city. And then we wanted to do it during what they call open streets, which is when you temporarily close down streets for people to bike and walk. Oklahoma City just did it on Sunday, by the way. And we thought if we could do the projects then, we'd have 10,000 and 3,000 people, more or less, to experience this change and give us that feedback. That's a heck of a lot more people than would come out on a Tuesday night to a workshop. So that's what the after looked like on the ground. This is tempera paint, crates that we got for about $6 from a local manufacturer, and plants that we borrowed from a local nursery. And we were able to sit here for the course of the 2 days and have conversations with all these people about the pedestrian space that also, by the way, supported the event. They don't close the street to traffic, as you can see, and you have 10,000 people on a 5-foot sidewalk. Quite uncomfortable. For open streets, we wanted to connect protected bikeways that would feed into the actual closed street, which is about 2 miles of closed roadway. And so we set up 3 different types of bikeways that would link into that network. We created Burlington's first parking protected lane. People in the city had never seen something like this. We wanted to test out this design because we were thinking about it anyways for the design of this street. We're going to enhance the crossings, make cyclists more visible and predictable, as well as pedestrians. And then we were going to ask a lot of questions and get a lot of people to give us the feedback that we were looking to include into that planning process, including doing a tech survey where we received about 350 surveys in one day. And of course, this is largely about trying to convince people who like to say no to all of our plans, which tends to be the fire department. And we said, if you're so concerned about this project, come out and show us what works and what doesn't work, and then we can have a real conversation out in the street as opposed to arguing over concepts and ideas that are on paper in City Hall. And we learned a lot. We learned that cars on these two protected bikeway streets, in terms of their speeds, we saw beforehand, working with the MPO and actually evaluating the speeds, is that people were, about 1 out of 4 cars were speeding through the neighborhood. On both streets, we did during the protected bikeway demonstration, and that speeding went down to about 5%. So we saw a good impact there. We saw a lot of feedback from the tech survey on where people want that kind of infrastructure, and would that actually make them cycle more? And we found that 42% of respondents would bike more if a lot of the key streets in town had protected bikeways. So this was giving us a lot of good information for our master plan. And then that translates directly into us thinking about the design of the street. Now this is that street that got the parking protected bike lane. And while we were setting up the project itself, it gives us so many opportunities to talk to people, including property owners, who are wondering what the heck we're doing. And what we learned was that people who live on these blocks don't necessarily park on the street. They park in their garages and in their driveways behind their homes. The people who park on the street are those who come from out of town, who either work or are trying to shop downtown, and who are trying to avoid the meters, which start 1 block away from the end of our project. Right? So this is on-the-ground design intelligence that we were only able to gain through doing the demonstration project and talking to these folks. And so we said, if we removed a lane of parking and came up with a very short-term interim design for a year or two, you would be okay with that. And the community said yes. So that's what got put into the plan. And then we came up with a longer-term vision, which by the way, these little, what we call armadillos, these barriers, those are good for the fire department to be able to get over them to get to the curb, so we relieve their concerns as well. Same with this mountable curb, which could also possibly incorporate rain gardens and some stormwater treatment in the design, but be more robust to protect cyclists, and of course still allow the fire department to get where they needed to go. So through the demonstration, through the testing, through the feedback, we were able to kind of get a win-win situation in how we would lay out the street in the plan. And I think what more importantly is the city learned that these kinds of things that the volunteers had been doing just weeks prior were actually viable. So within 5 weeks' time, this is now, we've gone from volunteers in the orange vest to the city public works department out there doing the exact same projects that we had the volunteers remove just weeks prior. And that's what those look like, just a couple examples. And what the city also learned is they could scale this up. This does not have to be on like 3 or 4 blocks. This could be a corridor-wide approach. So they've been using 2 different types of material barriers to test out these interim projects as pilots for 1 mile-long corridor in the city, and getting a lot of feedback to understand how should we design this street in the future. And finally, what the advocacy sector learned was that because of the new policy, because of what because of the framework we put into place with the city's support, then the low resource advocacy organization, Local Motion, could then invest some of their resources into developing a toolkit for these projects. And they not only work in Burlington, they work statewide. So we worked with Local Motion following the passing of this ordinance and this policy to create a trailer that is full of materials for pop-up and demonstration projects. So now this is going around the state of Vermont, and they can do crosswalks, curb extensions, plazas, medians, bike lanes, you name it, in the street because they've got all the materials in that trailer. And then finally, back to Peggy O'Neill. This story has a happy ending. This is Peggy being featured in an NPR story about this policy and about this approach that Burlington has adopted to let citizens do their own projects. And now they've got 5 or 6 different project types that you can get permission for to go out and just do if you want to with your neighbors in your streets. So 5 lessons that are perhaps some takeaways is that we can embed tactical urbanism into the municipal project delivery process, like you see in Burlington. Again, they're seeing this as the early stages and phases of implementing the master plan to build that political will and to educate people. You can take existing projects off the shelf and test them out. That's like the Miami example where they'd created this plan in theory about creating those pedestrian promenade spaces on Biscayne Boulevard, but we wanted to actually go showcase that. You can open up the project delivery process by working with a lot of partners, partnering with festivals and other organizations in town, like we did in Miami with the 30 different groups who were engaged in Biscayne Green. Take advantage of existing initiatives to find multipliers. Do your projects when you have an event with 10,000 people, right? Don't do it on a weekend when no one's in town. Do it when you've got a captive audience. And then finally, this lesson I think has continually come up today, which is to scale down before you scale up. Start something really small, really lightweight, really quick, at a small level, and then learn from it before you can scale yourself back up. I feel that if we had not done Parking Day in 2011 and kind of learned about that process, working with the city, how we get permission, what are the materials, we would have had the success in instigating Biscayne Green at the larger level following that. There's one more lesson. You can get away with anything if you wear an orange vest. Thank you.